Moving into Oakwood Estates felt like achieving the American dream. After years of saving every spare dollar, my wife and I finally purchased our first home in what the realtor described as the most prestigious community in the county. The neighborhood boasted wide streets lined with mature oak trees, identical brick mailboxes adorned with copper numbers, and lawns so perfect they looked painted rather than grown. On that first morning, I stood on our driveway breathing in the scent of freshly cut grass and feeling a sense of pride I had never experienced before. The welcome basket arrived that afternoon, delivered by a woman with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "I am Karen Wilkins, president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association," she announced, handing me a heavy binder along with the basket. "This contains all our community guidelines. I recommend you read it thoroughly before making any changes to your property." Her eyes scanned our moving boxes with obvious disapproval before she added, "We take our standards very seriously here." The HOA binder contained 147 pages of rules. Guidelines dictated everything from acceptable paint colors to the height of grass, the types of flowers permitted in front gardens, and even how long garbage bins could remain at the curb. I found it excessive, but was determined to be a good neighbor. We wanted to fit in, to belong in this perfect community. Our first violation notice came just 3 weeks after moving in. Unapproved window treatments visible from street. My wife had hung temporary paper blinds in our home office while waiting for the custom blinds we had ordered. The second notice arrived 10 days later. Decorative rock border not on approved landscape design list. The rocks had been there when we purchased the house. Each violation came with Karen's signature and a note indicating a courtesy inspection had been conducted. I began noticing her silver SUV driving slowly past our house several times a day. She would park across the street, take photographs of our property, and make notes on her ever-present clipboard. When I waved, she would simply drive away without acknowledgement. "Be careful with that one," our neighbor Tom warned me one evening as we retrieved our mail. "Karen has been running the HOA like her personal kingdom for years. She has a special hatred for new homeowners. Last year, she forced the Johnsons to repaint their entire house because the shade of beige was apparently 2 shades darker than what had been approved." My garage renovation project seemed to particularly trigger her scrutiny. The previous owners had left it in disarray, and I was determined to transform it into an organized workspace. This meant emptying everything onto the driveway, sorting through items, installing new shelving, and repainting the interior. The project would take several weekends, but Karen began documenting it from day one. The passive-aggressive notes escalated quickly. What began as friendly reminders about garage doors remaining closed when not in active use became formal warnings about eyesores visible to the community. Each note was more threatening than the last, with highlighted references to specific HOA regulations and potential consequences for noncompliance. As autumn leaves began to fall, so did any pretense of neighborly relations. Karen no longer bothered with fake pleasantries when conducting her inspections. She would stand at the edge of our property, photographing every detail, muttering about maintaining standards and property values. Other neighbors began warning us about her campaigns against previous homeowners who had dared to challenge her authority. I did not realize it then, but I had become her newest target. The garage renovation that was supposed to be a simple home improvement project was transforming into the battleground for a neighborhood power struggle that would eventually expose secrets no one in Oakwood Estates could have imagined. The situation took a disturbing turn on a Tuesday morning in late October. I had left for work earlier than usual for a meeting, but forgot my presentation notes. Returning home unexpectedly at 9:30 a.m., I caught Karen standing in my driveway, photographing the interior of my garage with her phone. She did not hear my car approach and continued documenting every corner of my property, as if conducting an inventory. "Excuse me," I called out, startling her. "Can I help you with something?" Karen straightened her posture, clutching her clipboard like armor. "I am conducting an inspection. There have been complaints about the visual condition of your property." She spoke with the authority of someone who had never been questioned. "From whom?" I asked. "And does the HOA allow you to enter private property without permission?" "I did not enter your property," she replied coldly, though she was clearly standing on my driveway. "And the HOA bylaws allow for regular inspections to ensure community standards are maintained." Before I could respond, she turned and walked briskly to her SUV, leaving me standing in confused frustration. That afternoon, the first official warning letter arrived in our mailbox. The envelope contained high-resolution photographs of my garage interior, with circles highlighting areas of excessive disorganization visible from street and inappropriate storage of renovation materials. The letter threatened fines of $100 per day if the violations were not remedied within 72 hours. I spent that entire weekend reorganizing the garage, moving everything away from the door, and even purchasing expensive storage cabinets to hide tools and supplies. My wife thought I was overreacting, but something about Karen's intensity worried me. There was an obsessive quality to her scrutiny that felt personal rather than procedural. The following Wednesday, I noticed my new cordless drill was missing. I had used it the previous evening and distinctly remembered placing it on my workbench. By Friday, several other items had disappeared: a specialized woodworking tool, a power sander, and a box of expensive drill bits. None of these items were cheap, and all had been securely stored in my garage. "Maybe we should install security cameras," my wife suggested after I mentioned the missing tools. "It could be teenagers, or maybe someone noticed all your nice equipment while the garage was open during your project." The cameras were installed the following Monday, positioned to capture both the garage interior and the driveway. 2 days later, while reviewing the footage during my lunch break, my blood ran cold. The recording clearly showed Karen entering our property at 10:15 a.m., methodically examining items in the garage and taking photographs of specific tools and equipment. Though the footage did not show her taking anything, her unauthorized presence on our property was undeniable. That evening, a second HOA letter arrived, even more threatening than the first. It cited continued noncompliance and increased the potential fine to $250 per day. The letter also mentioned possible legal action if the situation was not remedied immediately. What struck me most was that several of the items flagged as improperly stored in the accompanying photographs were exactly the items that had gone missing. Confused and increasingly concerned, I sought advice from neighbors. Tom invited me in for coffee when I mentioned the escalating situation. "You are not the first," he said gravely. "Karen has been terrorizing homeowners for years. The Martinez family 3 doors down had a similar issue with her constant inspections and missing garden equipment. The Phillips family eventually sold their house below market value just to escape her harassment." Other neighbors shared similar stories over the following days. Karen had a pattern of targeting newcomers to the neighborhood, those who would not recognize if items suddenly appeared in her possession or at community yard sales. One elderly resident confided that she had stopped using her patio after Karen began documenting unapproved outdoor accessories, and subsequently noticed her custom cushions being used at the community pool weeks later. The security camera footage continued to capture Karen's regular visits during weekday mornings. always when most residents would be at work, always with her clipboard, always focused on documenting the contents of my garage rather than any actual violations. I began to suspect that something far more sinister than HOA power trips was motivating her obsessive behavior. The persistent disappearance of items following her inspections could not be coincidental. What began as annoyance had evolved into genuine concern. This was not merely about control or community standards. There was a calculating precision to her actions that suggested something more predatory. As winter approached, I realized I was dealing with someone who viewed HOA authority not as a responsibility, but as a weapon and a shield for behavior no one had yet dared to challenge. The final warning letter arrived on a Friday afternoon in early December, printed on official HOA letterhead, with bold red text announcing, "Final notice before legal action." The letter claimed persistent violations despite previous warnings, and stated that the HOA board had unanimously approved legal proceedings to enforce compliance. Most concerning was the threat that county inspectors would be asked to evaluate whether the condition of my garage constituted a public safety hazard. That evening, while organizing my remaining tools, I discovered that my limited edition cordless impact driver, a gift from my father, was missing. The security footage from that morning showed Karen once again on my property, this time opening storage cabinets and examining their contents. Something inside me snapped. This had gone beyond HOA overreach into something that felt criminal. The next morning, I spotted Karen conducting another inspection of a neighbor's backyard. Without planning my words, I approached her directly. "I need to speak with you about the missing items from my garage," I said firmly, "and about you entering my property without permission." Karen's expression flickered briefly before hardening into indignation. "I do not know what you are talking about," she responded. "As HOA president, I have every right to document violations. Perhaps if you kept your property in order, things would not go missing." "I have security footage," I replied, watching her face carefully. "It shows you entering my garage repeatedly when no one is home." Her reaction was immediate and explosive. "Are you accusing me of theft?" she hissed, loud enough for nearby neighbors to hear. "That is defamation. I will not be harassed by homeowners who refuse to maintain community standards." She raised her clipboard like a shield. "In fact, I am calling the authorities right now. Your garage has become a safety hazard and a public nuisance." True to her word, Karen pulled out her phone and made a call, her voice carrying across the quiet street as she reported dangerous conditions and threatening behavior at my address. Neighbors began appearing on porches and driveways, drawn by the commotion. I returned home, equal parts angry and anxious about what would happen next. The police arrived 90 minutes later, 2 cruisers pulling into my driveway with lights flashing but no sirens. Karen appeared moments later, parking her SUV across the street. She approached the officers before they could reach my door, clipboard extended like credentials. From my window, I could see her gesturing animatedly toward my garage. When I opened the door, the officers introduced themselves professionally. "Sir, we have received a complaint about unsafe conditions and potential building code violations," the taller officer explained. "Would you mind if we take a look at your garage?" "Of course," I agreed, leading them outside where Karen waited with barely concealed satisfaction. "I have nothing to hide." The garage that had become the center of this neighborhood drama was now more organized than most display models in home improvement stores. The officers walked through slowly, exchanging glances that suggested they were struggling to identify what might constitute a hazard. "Everything seems to be in order," the first officer finally said. I do not see any code violations or safety concerns. Karen stepped forward, pointing aggressively at my workbench. Look at those chemicals, and those tools could be dangerous in the wrong hands, and he has been harassing me, accusing me of ridiculous things. The second officer, who had remained quieter during the inspection, suddenly stiffened. His attention had shifted to something outside, Karen's SUV parked across the street. From our vantage point in the garage, the open trunk was partially visible. The officer stepped outside for a better look, then whispered something to his partner. "Ms. Wilkins," the first officer said carefully, "is that your vehicle across the street?" "Yes, but I do not see how that is relevant," Karen replied, her voice sharp with impatience. "Could you explain why you have what appears to be a DeWalt limited edition impact driver in your trunk?" The officer continued. "We took a report just yesterday about a similar item being stolen in this neighborhood." The color drained from Karen's face. In her haste to orchestrate this confrontation, she had left her trunk partially open, revealing items she had collected during her morning inspections. The second officer was already walking toward her vehicle, speaking quietly into his radio. I purchased that recently," Karen stammered, her composure cracking. "For my husband. It was going to be a Christmas gift." "That is a limited edition model," I said quietly. "I reported mine missing yesterday. It was a gift from my father. It has his initials engraved on the handle." The atmosphere shifted dramatically as the officers exchanged knowing looks. What had begun as a nuisance call about HOA violations was transforming into something entirely different. The officer by Karen's vehicle called out confirmation that he could see the engraved initials I had described. Karen's clipboard lowered for the first time since I had known her. The neighborhood had fallen silent, curtains twitching in windows as residents observed the unfolding scene. The power dynamic that had defined our interactions for months collapsed in an instant, toppled by a single observation and an open trunk. "Ms. Wilkins," the first officer said formally, "we need to ask you some additional questions about the items in your vehicle. And sir," he added, turning to me, "we may need you to identify some property." Justice had arrived on my doorstep, but not through HOA bylaws or community standards. It had come through criminal statutes that even the most powerful neighborhood tyrant could not manipulate or evade. The investigation unfolded with methodical precision over the next several hours. Additional police officers arrived, and a perimeter was established around Karen's SUV. When they conducted a formal search of her vehicle, they found not only my impact driver but also the cordless drill, power sander, and drill bits that had disappeared from my garage. What stunned everyone, including the officers, was the discovery of a detailed inventory list in Karen's glove compartment. Page after page of items documented by address with approximate values noted in the margins. Detective Ramirez, who arrived about an hour into the investigation, approached me as I stood watching from my driveway. "We need to ask you some questions about your missing items," he said. "But first, I should let you know this appears to be much larger than just your tools. The list we found suggests this has been going on for quite some time." Inside my home, I provided detailed descriptions of everything that had disappeared, including photographs of some items I had taken for insurance purposes. The detective nodded grimly as he compared my information to entries on the inventory list they had found. "Based on this list and the items in her vehicle, we have enough for a search warrant," he explained. "We believe there may be significantly more stolen property at her residence." By late afternoon, The entire neighborhood watched in stunned disbelief as police vehicles surrounded Karen's immaculate colonial-style home 3 blocks away. Her husband, a quiet man who traveled frequently for business, arrived home to find officers executing a search warrant on his property. His genuine shock was evident even from a distance as neighbors gathered at a respectful perimeter established by patrol officers. The search of Karen's home revealed what one officer later described as a department store of stolen goods. The finished basement had been transformed into an organized storage facility, with items carefully arranged by category. Power tools in one section, electronics in another, garden equipment along one wall, and household items meticulously displayed on custom shelving. Each item was labeled with a small sticker containing what appeared to be a code, later determined to be abbreviated street addresses and house numbers. News traveled quickly through the neighborhood communication channels. By evening, a steady stream of residents arrived at the police perimeter, many describing items that had gone missing from their properties over the past several years. Detective Ramirez and his team began the painstaking process of cataloging each item and matching reports from neighborhood residents. "We have never seen anything quite like this," he told a small group of us who had gathered near my home. "She appears to have been systematically stealing from homes throughout the community, using her position as HOA president to conduct what she called inspections as cover for casing properties." Karen's husband appeared devastated by the revelations. When he approached the detective to offer his cooperation, I overheard him say he had been completely unaware of his wife's activities. "I travel 4 days a week," he explained, his voice hollow with shock. "She told me she found great deals at estate sales and online auctions. I never questioned how she acquired so many new things." The following day, more officers arrived with evidence collection teams to continue documenting the stolen items. The systematic nature of Karen's operation became increasingly apparent. She had targeted primarily new homeowners who would not recognize if neighborhood items suddenly appeared in her possession. She had used her authority to enter properties legally under the guise of inspections, methodically documenting valuable items before returning when residents were away. Most disturbing was the discovery of detailed notebooks containing what amounted to surveillance information on virtually every home in the neighborhood. Work schedules noted for each household, security system information, observations about when certain residents traveled or were away from home for extended periods. What had appeared to neighbors as overzealous enforcement of community standards had actually been a sophisticated system for identifying and acquiring valuable property. She was using HOA violations as both cover and revenge, Tom explained as we watched police carry box after box from Karen's home. If you challenged her authority or questioned her inspections, she would bombard you with violation notices to keep you distracted while she continued stealing from you and others. Neighbors gathered in small groups throughout the community, sharing stories that suddenly made sense in this new context. The Martinez family realized their missing garden sculpture had been repurposed in Karen's backyard rock garden, painted a different color but unmistakably theirs. The Phillips family, who had moved away months earlier, called former neighbors after hearing the news. Their missing electronics and jewelry had been documented in Karen's inventory, but sold long before the discovery. For me, the emotional impact was complex and conflicting. There was vindication in knowing I had not imagined the violations of privacy and property. But there was also disgust at the calculated nature of the deception, the way Karen had weaponized community trust and authority. Most of all, there was a profound sense of violation knowing someone had systematically documented my possessions with the intention of taking them. The community watched in collective disbelief as Karen was formally arrested that evening. The woman who had lectured us all about property values and community standards was escorted to a police cruiser in handcuffs, her perfect appearance disrupted for the first time since I had known her. Her expression remained defiant even as neighbors she had terrorized for years watched from their driveways. The most disturbing part, Detective Ramirez told us later, is how her perfectionism and rule enforcement created the perfect cover. Who would suspect the person most obsessed with community standards would be the one systematically violating the most basic standards of decency and law? She created a climate of fear that prevented anyone from questioning her authority or movements. As twilight settled over the neighborhood that evening, residents lingered outdoors longer than usual, connecting with each other in ways they never had before. The shared experience of betrayal was creating new bonds between neighbors who had previously only exchanged polite nods. Karen's reign of terror had ended, but the process of understanding the full extent of her actions and reclaiming our sense of community safety was only beginning. The news of Karen's arrest spread far beyond our neighborhood. By the following morning, local news vans lined the entrance to Oakwood Estates, reporters eager to cover the story of an HOA president whose obsession with community standards had concealed a years-long theft operation. Residents found themselves reluctantly famous, with neighbors from surrounding communities driving slowly past Karen's home to glimpse the scene of what was being called the HOA heist. An emergency HOA meeting was called for Saturday morning. The community center, normally used for seasonal parties and swimming pool registration, was filled beyond capacity. Board members looked shell-shocked as they took their places at the front table. The vice president, a retired school principal named David, attempted to bring the meeting to order 3 times before the crowd quieted. "We are as stunned as all of you," he began, his voice wavering slightly. "None of us had any knowledge of Karen's activities. We are cooperating fully with police and will ensure that proper procedures are followed for returning recovered items to their rightful owners." Karen's husband stood up next. The transformation in his appearance was startling. The confident, well-dressed executive had been replaced by a hollow-eyed man who looked as though he had aged a decade in 3 days. "I want to apologize personally to each of you," he said, his voice barely audible at first. "I had no knowledge of what my wife was doing, but that does not absolve me of responsibility. I have provided police with access to all financial records and will personally ensure that everything is returned or compensated for." The meeting quickly evolved from procedural to cathartic, as residents began sharing stories of their interactions with Karen. What emerged was a portrait of calculated intimidation that had silenced the community for years. 3 other board members admitted they had been afraid to challenge Karen's decisions for fear of becoming targets themselves. One confessed that Karen had threatened to expose his daughter's minor legal trouble if he opposed her proposals for stricter enforcement measures. "She kept files on everyone," explained Marjorie, the board secretary. "Not just violation notices, but personal information she could use if anyone challenged her authority. We were all afraid of becoming her next target." Outside the community center, television crews interviewed residents about the stolen property and the atmosphere of intimidation. I found myself unexpectedly thrust into a spokesperson role after several neighbors mentioned how my security camera footage had helped break the case. A reporter thrust a microphone toward me, asking how it felt to be the one who had exposed the HOA thief. "I never set out to expose anyone," I responded uncomfortably. "I just wanted to understand why things kept disappearing from my garage. I think this shows how important it is for communities to have checks and balances, even at the neighborhood level." The community divided in its response to the crisis. Some residents expressed compassion for Karen's husband and family, arguing they were victims too. Others demanded maximum consequences, sharing stories of how Karen's harassment had affected their lives. What surprised me most was how quickly the narrative shifted, how the woman who had been feared and obeyed just days earlier was now openly described as a bully and thief by people who had previously enabled her behavior through their silence. Detective Ramirez established a temporary processing center in the community clubhouse where residents could submit claims for stolen items. The line stretched around the building for hours. As people waited, they exchanged stories, many meeting their neighbors properly for the first time despite having lived near each other for years. Phone numbers were exchanged, coffee dates arranged, offers of help extended. It is strange how something so terrible can lead to something positive, observed an elderly woman who lived at the end of my street. I have felt isolated here for years, afraid to use my garden because Karen would document every weed. Now I am meeting people who have lived 2 houses away for a decade. The media attention created an additional layer of stress for many residents who valued their privacy. News helicopters circled overhead, photographing the police activity at Karen's home. Social media filled with speculation and exaggerated accounts of the thefts. Out-of-town relatives called after seeing the story on national news programs. Through it all, I found myself in an unexpected role as part of the neighborhood's healing process. Because my case had triggered the investigation, people approached me with questions, concerns, and stories they needed to share. Each conversation revealed another layer of how deeply Karen's reign of terror had affected the community. Homes sold at losses to escape her harassment, renovation projects abandoned after constant citations, elderly residents afraid to sit on their own porches. The community center, once mainly empty except during scheduled events, became an impromptu gathering place where residents processed their collective trauma. What none of us had realized was how isolated we had all become, each family believing they alone were targeted by Karen's obsessive enforcement. The shared experience of betrayal was painful, but it was creating connections that years of proximity had failed to forge. The legal proceedings against Karen began 3 weeks after her arrest. The preliminary hearing was held in the county courthouse, a formal building of red brick and white columns that stood in stark contrast to the suburban battlefield where our conflict had begun. I arrived early, having been called as a witness to identify my stolen property and testify about the pattern of harassment I had experienced. The courtroom projectors a sense of timeless authority with its polished wooden benches and state seal mounted behind the judge's bench. It lent gravity to what some might have dismissed as merely neighborhood drama, a reminder that violations of trust and property were serious matters regardless of their setting. Karen appeared transformed in her defendant's attire. Gone was the perfectly coordinated wardrobe and commanding presence that had made neighbors tremble at the sight of her approaching their property. She sat beside her attorney in a simple blue dress, her posture rigid but her expression subdued. Without her clipboard and authority, she seemed diminished, almost ordinary. The prosecutor, a methodical woman with clear confidence in her case, laid out the charges. Multiple counts of burglary, trespassing, theft, harassment, and intimidation. The evidence was overwhelming, not just the physical items recovered from Karen's home but her own meticulous records that documented each theft. The inventory lists included dates, locations, estimated values, and in some cases, notes about how she had accessed the properties. When my turn came to testify, I approached the witness stand with unexpected nervousness. I had rehearsed my statement dozens of times, but suddenly felt the weight of responsibility. My testimony would help shape another person's fate. I described finding items missing, installing security cameras, capturing footage of Karen entering my property without permission, and finally, the confrontation that led to police involvement. "And to your knowledge," the prosecutor asked, "did Ms. Wilkins have permission to enter your property or remove items from your garage?" "No," I responded firmly. "She did not have permission to enter my property except for official HOA inspections, which should have been scheduled in advance, and she never had permission to remove anything." Karen's defense strategy became clear as her attorney cross-examined witnesses. They attempted to portray her actions as symptoms of kleptomania and undiagnosed mental illness, rather than calculated criminal behavior. Her lawyer described a woman, overwhelmed by compulsions she could not control, and using her position as a cry for help rather than for personal gain. The judge's response to this narrative was swift and clear. "The court notes," she stated during a particularly strained line of questioning, "that mental health challenges may explain behavior but do not excuse criminal actions, particularly those conducted with the level of planning and documentation evident in this case." What most stunned the courtroom was the revelation that this was not Karen's first community to terrorize. The prosecution presented evidence that she had held HOA leadership positions in 2 previous neighborhoods in different counties, both of which had experienced similar patterns of missing items and aggressive enforcement. She had moved on when residents began connecting the disappearances to her inspections, always selecting a new community where her reputation had not preceded her. The victim impact statements created a powerful mosaic of collective trauma. 23 residents from our neighborhood testified about items stolen, privacy violated, and the atmosphere of fear Karen had created. Elderly residents described becoming prisoners in their own homes, afraid to use their gardens or patios. Families explained how children had become anxious about playing outdoors for fear of violating some unknown rule. Several people had sought therapy to deal with the stress of constant surveillance and harassment. The defendant did not merely steal objects, the prosecutor summarized. She stole people's sense of safety and belonging in their own homes. She used a position of trust to violate the very community she was elected to protect. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later drew even more attention than the trial itself. The courtroom was filled with Oakwood Estates residents, many of whom had never set foot in a courthouse before this case. Karen's husband sat alone in the front row, still looking shell-shocked by how completely his life had unraveled. The judge's sentencing statement was measured but firm. "The court recognizes the serious nature of these crimes," she stated. "Not only the theft of property, but the breach of community trust and abuse of authority. The systematic nature of these crimes, conducted over several years and in multiple communities, indicates this was not impulsive behavior but calculated criminal activity." Karen was sentenced to 6 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after serving 4 years. She was also ordered to pay restitution to all identified victims and prohibited from serving in any community leadership position following her release. She showed no visible reaction as the sentence was announced, her expression as controlled as it had been during her HOA inspections. As we left the courthouse, I felt no joy in the outcome, only the sobering satisfaction of accountability finally reaching someone who had believed herself above the rules she had so zealously enforced on others. The legal system had recognized what our neighborhood had failed to check, that authority without oversight inevitably corrupts, and that community standards mean nothing if they do not begin with basic decency and respect. Spring arrived with symbolic timing 3 months after Karen's sentencing. The first HOA meeting under new leadership was held not in the closed community center conference room, but on the wide lawn beside the neighborhood pool. Residents brought lawn chairs and blankets, forming a casual circle that physically represented the new transparency in governance. The newly elected board, led by Tom as president and including 4 other residents who had never previously served, presented a dramatically revised set of community guidelines. The document had been reduced from 147 pages to 28, focusing on necessary maintenance standards rather than aesthetic control. Our goal is to maintain the neighborhood's value and appearance without micromanaging how people live in their homes, Tom explained. We are neighbors first, not enforcement officers. I found myself in an unexpected leadership role, having been asked to chair a committee reviewing the community inspection process. We established clear boundaries. Inspections would be conducted only with advance notice, always with the homeowner present, and by pairs of board members rather than individuals. No inspections would focus on garage interiors or backyards unless specific safety concerns had been reported. The recovery event for stolen items became a healing ritual for the community. Detective Ramirez and his team had meticulously cataloged every item found in Karen's home and storage units she had rented under various names. The community center was transformed into a temporary lost and found, with tables arranged by category. Residents moved slowly through the displays, sometimes finding items they had forgotten were missing or had never realized were stolen. "I thought I had donated this to Goodwill years ago," exclaimed one elderly resident, holding a decorative bird bath. "It disappeared from my garden and Karen told me teenagers must have taken it as a prank. I never imagined she had it all this time." Karen's former home stood empty through the winter, a silent reminder of how quickly unchecked authority can corrupt. Her husband had moved to another state to escape the notoriety of the case, first offering the house to the community as restitution. The new HOA board declined, believing the property should be sold to welcome new neighbors who could be part of the rebuilding process. My garage renovation, the project that had sparked the entire conflict, was finally completed in April. The space that had been the battleground for so much conflict was transformed into an organized workshop where I could pursue woodworking projects without fear of documentation or violation notices. Neighbors occasionally stopped by to check on my progress or share stories of their own home improvements, now undertaken without fear of arbitrary enforcement. Most powerful was the transformation in how residents interacted with each other. What had been a community of isolated households became a neighborhood of genuine connections. The spring brought impromptu gatherings on front lawns, children playing freely across adjacent yards, and a community garden established on a previously restricted common area. As summer approached, a young family purchased Karen's former home. Rather than greeting them with inspection schedules and violation warnings, neighbors organized a welcome party on their front lawn. Children played on the grass without concern for its precise height, and a table of homemade food replaced the rule binder that had been Karen's version of a welcome gift. It is strange to think about how differently things could have gone, I reflected to my wife as we walked home from the gathering. If the police had never looked in her car that day, she might still be terrorizing the neighborhood and stealing from everyone. The lesson that emerged from our ordeal was powerful in its simplicity. True community safety comes not from rigid enforcement of rules, but from neighbors who genuinely look out for one another's welfare. The perfectly manicured lawns remained, but they now existed alongside basketball hoops, chalk drawings on driveways, and porch gatherings that would have earned violation notices in the previous regime. In the end, our neighborhood found something valuable amid the betrayal and recovery: the knowledge that standards matter less than connections, and that true security comes from community rather than control.